the nationwide blackout meant to silence Iran, or did it expose the regime's deepest weakness in real time? As darkness fell across Tehran and mobile networks went dead, officials insisted order had been restored under emergency measures. Yet within hours, the blackout produced the opposite effect. It stripped the state of narrative control and revealed how fragile its grip had become at street level. If a government turns off the lights to project strength, what does it mean when the flames become the only illumination left? What unfolded next mattered less for its spectacle than for its implications. Verified images and eyewitness accounts showed smoke columns rising from multiple districts, not sporadic chaos, but a pattern suggesting coordination. Under martial law, security forces were deployed at scale, yet the blackout limited their command and control as much as it constrained civilians. Analysts noted that cutting internet access, long used to fragment protest movements, now risks accelerating offline coordination and rumor-driven mobilization. The first hours after the shutdown made one point unmistakable: the information void did not calm the streets. It energized them. This dynamic echoed a broader lesson playing out beyond Iran's borders. In Eastern Europe, recent reporting from major English-language outlets has detailed how Ukraine's precision strikes on Russian energy infrastructure substations, depots, and fuel nodes have repeatedly turned Moscow's attempts at coercive pressure into strategic liabilities. Each strike disrupted not only power, but confidence, forcing Russia to divert air defenses and resources inward. The parallel is instructive. When a state weaponizes darkness, it risks conceding initiative to those who can operate without it. Inside Iran, the blackout coincided with a visible shift in target selection. Rather than dispersing aimlessly, groups converged on symbols of administrative authority. The intent appeared less about spectacle than about delegitimization, undermining the claim that the state could still deliver basic governance. Western security analysts framed this as a systems challenge where legitimacy erodes faster than physical control. Once that perception takes hold, restoring order becomes exponentially harder. Washington watched closely. With Donald Trump currently serving as U.S. president, senior officials emphasized public restraint while quietly coordinating with allies. NATO briefings underscored a familiar risk: internal instability in a heavily armed state can trigger miscalculation beyond its borders. The lesson drawn from Ukraine's energy war was cited again: pressure on infrastructure reshapes strategic timelines and raises escalation thresholds for everyone involved. For Europe, already managing energy security, concerns the prospect of prolonged Iranian instability added another variable to a crowded risk matrix. On the ground, Tehran's blackout became a stress test of loyalty. Security units faced conflicting signals: hold positions, restore order, avoid international scrutiny, while lacking reliable communications. That friction mattered. History suggests that when orders slow and narratives fracture, discipline weakens. Western experts pointed to data from past crises showing that morale, not manpower, is the first casualty of prolonged information denial. The blackout inadvertently accelerated that curve. Crucially, the state's messaging lagged reality. Official broadcasts declared calm, even as independent verification showed otherwise. This gap widened distrust and fueled the sense that the authorities were reacting, not leading. In Ukraine, Russia's early war messaging failures produced similar effects. Once credibility cracks, every statement is discounted, and every rumor gains traction. Tehran's first night under blackout followed that script with unnerving precision. As dawn approached, the question was no longer whether the blackout had worked. It plainly had not, but what came after. Energy information and legitimacy had collided in a single night, revealing a vulnerability that could not be patched by restoring service alone. Meanwhile, the focus began to shift from darkness itself to the targets illuminated by the fires, setting the stage for a far more consequential turn in the streets. Did the unrest cross a point of no return the moment protesters stopped marching and started choosing targets? As the night progressed, the pattern became harder to dismiss. Banks, tax offices, and security headquarters were not incidental casualties of chaos, they were focal points. When crowds bypass symbols and strike systems, are they protesting or attempting to disable the state itself? What distinguished this phase was selectivity. Financial institutions associated with elite capital flows, revenue collection agencies tied to fiscal authority, and local command nodes of internal security all came under pressure. Western analysts describe this as a shift from expressive protest to infrastructure denial, a tactic designed to paralyze governance rather than merely voice dissent. The immediate effect is psychological confidence drains quickly when citizens see the machinery of the state visibly impaired. This mirrors dynamics observed elsewhere in contemporary conflict. Over the past year, Ukraine's campaign against Russian energy infrastructure has followed a similar logic. By targeting substations, depots, and fuel logistics, often with drones and precision munitions, Kyiv forced Moscow to defend assets far from the front line. Reporting from major English-language outlets emphasized that the damage was not only physical, it disrupted schedules, inflated costs, and exposed vulnerabilities in air defense coverage. The lesson is clear: when infrastructure becomes the battlefield, timelines compress and margins for error shrink. In Tehran, the implications were immediate. Attacks on tax offices struck at the state's cash flow, while damage to banks eroded trust in an already strained financial system. Economists note that once confidence collapses, restoring it requires more than repairs. It demands legitimacy. For a government already under pressure, that is the harder task. Western experts warned that even brief disruptions can cascade: missed payrolls, delayed services, and fraying loyalty among lower-tier officials. NATO planners monitoring the situation framed the development as a cautionary case. Infrastructure-focused unrest inside a regional power can ripple outward, especially when energy markets are tight and shipping lanes tense. Europe's experience with Russia's energy coercion has sharpened sensitivity to such risks. The takeaway circulating in Allied briefings was sobering: domestic instability, that target systems can generate external consequences faster than conventional unrest. From a security perspective, the state's response revealed constraints. Protecting every bank office and depot simultaneously is a logistical impossibility, as seen in Russia's attempts to shield its energy grid from Ukrainian strikes. Defenses thin quickly when assets are dispersed. Tehran faced a similar dilemma: concentrate forces and concede space, or disperse and risk losing control everywhere. Either choice signaled weakness. The narrative battle also intensified. Official statements framed the incidents as isolated vandalism, yet visual evidence suggested coordination. This discrepancy mattered. In modern crises, credibility competes with footage, and footage often wins. Analysts drew parallels to early phases of the Ukraine war, when mismatches between claims and images accelerated international skepticism. Once that skepticism sets in, diplomatic maneuvering becomes more difficult. Washington's posture remained cautious. With Donald Trump as U.S. president, the administration emphasized monitoring and de-escalation publicly, while privately assessing contingencies with allies. The strategic concern was not endorsement of unrest, but prevention of spillover, miscalculation, proxy escalation, or sudden disruptions to regional energy flows. In this context, infrastructure attacks inside Iran were viewed less as a local disturbance and more as a variable in a broader security equation. As dawn broke, one reality stood out: the unrest had evolved. It was no longer defined by chance or crowds alone, but by the tangible strain placed on the state's ability to function. Yet what followed next, inside the very institutions meant to enforce order, would shock analysts and redefine the balance on the streets. What happens when fear, the most reliable pillar of authority, suddenly stops working? As the unrest moved deeper into Tehran's institutional core, a decisive psychological shift became visible. If people are willing to storm guarded buildings and free detainees under martial law, what leverage does the state have left? The turning point was not the scale of the crowds, but the collapse of inhibition. Reports confirmed that security headquarters associated with internal control were breached, and detainees were released. For analysts, this moment mattered more than any fire. It signaled the rupture of the fear contract, the unspoken agreement that repression would be tolerated in exchange for survival. Once broken, that contract is rarely repaired. Western sociologists who study state failure note that regimes fall not when opposition grows louder, but when obedience becomes optional. This erosion of fear also exposed fractures within the enforcement apparatus itself. Units tasked with crowd control faced conflicting pressures: enforce orders aggressively and risk escalation, or hesitate and lose deterrence. History offers parallels. During Russia's early setbacks in Ukraine, reporting highlighted morale issues when units were overstretched, and narratives of inevitable victory clashed with battlefield reality. In Tehran, the same tension surfaced: orders existed, but conviction wavered. The economic dimension compounded the problem. With tax offices damaged and banks disrupted, questions emerged about the state's capacity to pay salaries consistently. Western economists emphasize that loyalty in security forces is often transactional. When compensation becomes uncertain, allegiance weakens. In Russia, Ukraine's repeated strikes on fuel depots and logistics hubs forced Moscow to reallocate funds and personnel, straining budgets and morale. The Iranian case echoed that pressure internally without an external battlefield. NATO analysts tracking the situation flagged a familiar warning sign: when regimes lose the ability to reward compliance, they default to punishment. Yet punishment requires manpower and legitimacy, both in short supply during widespread unrest. The result is a feedback loop where repression accelerates defiance rather than containing it. This pattern has been observed across multiple conflicts from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. Washington's assessment under President Donald Trump emphasized vigilance. Public statements avoided endorsement, focusing instead on stability and protection of regional interests. Privately, U.S. officials evaluated how internal fractures could alter Iran's external posture, particularly its reliance on proxies and deterrence rhetoric. The concern was that a regime under internal strain might adopt riskier behavior abroad to reassert authority at home. On the streets, symbolism mattered. Freed detainees became living proof that the state's grip was not absolute. Each breach sent a message faster than any broadcast could counter. Analysts pointed out that once images of liberated prisoners circulate, they undermine the very premise of omnipotence that sustains authoritarian control. The blackout intended to prevent this had already failed. This psychological collapse spread geographically. Reports from traditionally loyal regions indicated smaller but significant acts of defiance, suggesting that the unrest was no longer confined to one city or demographic. Western experts describe this as the diffusion phase, when resistance becomes normalized rather than exceptional. At that stage, suppressing it requires either overwhelming force or a credible political reset. Neither appeared imminent. Strategically, the implications extended beyond Iran. NATO planners linked the development to broader lessons from the Ukraine war. Morale and legitimacy are force multipliers. Precision strikes on infrastructure, whether external or internal, erode not just capacity, but belief. Once belief falters, control becomes episodic at best. As night fell again, the calculus had changed. The state still possessed weapons and manpower, but its most effective tool, fear, was dulled. Meanwhile, to compensate for this erosion, the regime began reaching for an option that would further inflame tensions and alter perceptions of legitimacy altogether. What does it signal when a state turns outward for muscle to control its own streets? As evidence mounted of internal hesitation among security units, reports began circulating that non-Iranian forces were being drawn into the equation. If authority depends on outsiders who do not share language, culture, or stake in society, can it still claim legitimacy? According to multiple open-source intelligence assessments cited by Western analysts, elements linked to foreign militias were observed reinforcing domestic security operations. While official confirmation remained absent, the pattern itself was revealing. Regimes typically resort to external auxiliaries when confidence in internal loyalty erodes. Political scientists describe this as the occupation logic, a last-ditch attempt to restore control by importing force while exporting responsibility. This move carries steep costs. Foreign units lack local knowledge, increasing the risk of miscalculation and civilian harm. Every such incident compounds anger and reframes the conflict from dissent to resistance. Analysts pointed to historical precedents where reliance on outsiders accelerated collapse by transforming protests into nationalist causes. Once that shift occurs, repression no longer intimidates. It unifies. The strategic parallel to ongoing conflicts elsewhere was not lost on observers. In Ukraine, Russia's dependence on auxiliary formations and redeployed units to protect energy infrastructure has strained cohesion and effectiveness. Western reporting highlighted how disparate forces with uneven training complicate command structures and slow response times. Tehran appeared to be courting a similar problem, adding manpower at the expense of coherence. NATO briefings emphasized the escalation risk. Foreign militias operating domestically blur legal and political lines, inviting international scrutiny and sanctions pressure. For Europe and the United States, the concern was less moral posturing than stability. Externalized repression tends to radicalize opposition and shorten decision cycles. In volatile regions, that volatility rarely remains contained. Washington's posture under President Donald Trump reflected this calculus. Publicly, officials reiterated calls for restraint and monitoring. Privately, contingency planning intensified. U.S. analysts warned that regimes under internal siege often adopt diversionary strategies, provocations abroad, designed to rally support at home. The presence of foreign forces on Iranian streets heightened that risk assessment. Economically, the decision compounded uncertainty. Investors and traders read foreign deployments as confirmation of systemic weakness. Western financial analysts noted that markets respond swiftly to signals of occupation logic pricing in prolonged instability. This feedback loop, security stress driving economic stress, mirrored the effects seen after Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy nodes, where confidence shocks amplified material damage. For the population, perception mattered more than policy. The sight or rumor of foreign fighters policing neighborhoods reframed the crisis. It was no longer a dispute between citizens and state, but a struggle over sovereignty itself. Sociological data from comparable crises shows that once this frame dominates, compromise becomes politically toxic for all sides. The regime's messaging struggled to adapt. Claims of restored order clashed with accounts of escalating force. Each discrepancy widened the credibility gap, reinforcing the sense that control was being propped up rather than exercised. Analysts stressed that legitimacy cannot be outsourced. When it is, the clock accelerates. As night operations continued, the introduction, real or perceived, of foreign elements altered the psychology of the streets. Fear gave way to defiance rooted in identity. Yet this externalization of force carried a price the leadership could ill afford, as economic reality and political rhetoric began colliding head-on. How does a government claim victory while its revenue streams burn in plain sight? As official statements projected confidence, the material foundations of authority were visibly eroding. When banks close, tax offices smolder, and payrolls come into question, can rhetoric still substitute for governance? The economic dimension of the crisis moved from abstract to immediate. Damage to financial institutions and revenue agencies struck at the circulatory system of the state. Western economists emphasized that governments survive unrest by maintaining cash flow, paying salaries, subsidies, and security forces. Disrupt that flow, and the cost of control spikes. In Tehran, the targeting of fiscal nodes suggested an understanding of this leverage. The message was not symbolic alone, it was operational. This dynamic resonates with recent developments in Eastern Europe. Over the past months, Ukraine's strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, transformer yards, refineries, and fuel depots have demonstrated how economic pressure compounds military strain. Reporting from major English-language outlets noted that even temporary outages forced Russia to reroute resources, inflate defense spending, and absorb reputational damage in energy markets. The Iranian case mirrored this logic internally. Economic stress multiplied political risk. Official responses struggled to bridge the gap. Public declarations framed events as isolated incidents under control, yet independent verification suggested otherwise. Analysts warn that such dissonance accelerates legitimacy loss. In the Ukraine conflict, early mismatches between Moscow's claims and observable outcomes eroded trust domestically and abroad. Tehran appeared to be entering a similar credibility spiral, where each assertion required greater force to sustain. NATO observers flagged another concern. Prolonged economic disruption inside Iran could alter its external behavior. States facing internal fiscal stress often seek leverage abroad through proxy activity, brinkmanship, or energy signaling to compensate for weakness at home. Europe, already sensitive to energy volatility, viewed this prospect with unease. Stability in the Middle East, long linked to global markets, was again at stake. Washington's assessment under President Donald Trump balanced caution with preparedness. Publicly, U.S. officials emphasized monitoring and deterrence. Privately, analysts examined scenarios where internal collapse pressures might intersect with regional flashpoints. The lesson drawn from Ukraine's energy war was instructive: economic warfare shortens decision windows. When revenues fall and expectations rise, leaders face incentives to act decisively or recklessly. For the population, economic pain translated into political clarity. The destruction of tax offices symbolized a rejection of a system perceived as extractive without reciprocity. Western sociologists argue that once citizens see fiscal institutions as illegitimate, compliance plummets. Tax refusal, capital flight, and informal economies follow, deepening the crisis. Each step reduces the state's capacity to recover. Meanwhile, leadership rhetoric hardened. Statements portraying unrest as defeated clashed with mounting evidence of strain. This posture, analysts suggest, reflects a familiar pattern: denial buys time but costs options. As with Russia's insistence on resilience amid energy disruptions, the narrative may rally a base temporarily while alienating the undecided. By the end of this phase, the contradiction was stark. The state spoke of control, yet the economy told a different story. Financial damage, credibility loss, and external scrutiny converged into a single pressure point. What followed next would push the crisis beyond domestic economics and onto a broader regional chessboard, forcing global actors to reassess their moves. Could a crisis born on the streets of Tehran redraw the strategic map of the entire region as internal pressure mounted attention, shifted outward to the calculations unfolding in Washington, Tel Aviv, Brussels, and beyond? When a state weakens from within, does deterrence abroad still hold, or does it invite a final test? The regional context sharpened quickly. Western intelligence assessments noted increased diplomatic and military signaling across the Middle East. The logic was familiar: regimes under domestic siege often seek external confrontation to regain initiative. Analysts compared this moment to historical precedents, where internal unrest compressed timelines and raised escalation risks. For allies, the challenge was to deter miscalculation without legitimizing repression. Recent reporting from major English-language outlets underscored how Ukraine's sustained campaign against Russian energy infrastructure has altered strategic thinking across NATO. Precision strikes combined with economic pressure demonstrated that resilience narratives can fracture under cumulative stress. Moscow's need to divert air defenses and repair capacity reshaped its posture, limiting options elsewhere. Observers applied the same framework to Iran: internal disruption plus external pressure narrows maneuver space. Israel's security establishment watched closely. Public statements emphasized readiness and deterrence, while analysts highlighted contingency planning tied to Iran's internal volatility. For Israel, the concern was not only immediate threats, but longer-term shifts, how a weakened Iran might recalibrate proxy strategies or risk escalation to compensate for domestic loss of control. The lesson from Ukraine's energy war loomed large when infrastructure and legitimacy are under attack. Leaders face stark choices. Washington's stance under President Donald Trump reflected a dual-track approach. Publicly, officials reiterated commitments to regional stability and alliance coordination. Privately, scenario planning intensified, weighing how internal fractures could intersect with nuclear missile and proxy dynamics. NATO partners emphasized unity, aware that fragmented messaging could invite adventurism. Europe, still managing the aftershocks of energy disruptions linked to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, prioritized de-escalation while preparing for contingencies. Economically, markets reacted to signals rather than statements. Analysts noted heightened sensitivity to any indication of prolonged instability in a major regional player. Energy traders, informed by the experience of Ukraine's strikes on Russian fuel nodes, priced in risk premiums tied to supply routes and choke points. The message was blunt: domestic crises do not stay domestic when infrastructure and geopolitics intersect. For Iran's population, the external dimension reinforced internal resolve. The sense that global actors were watching, calculating, added weight to the moment. Sociological studies suggest that when citizens perceive a regime as isolated internationally, the psychological balance shifts further. Isolation amplifies the cost of repression and reduces the credibility of endurance narratives. By this stage, the crisis had matured into something larger than unrest. It became a convergence of internal legitimacy collapse and external strategic pressure. The blackout that began as a tool of control ended as a signal broadcasting vulnerability to allies and adversaries alike. Yet the final question remained unresolved: would this convergence force restraint or accelerate a decisive gamble that reshapes the region?